I am so excited to have this conversation today about diving as method. We're going to hear from two incredible scholars and practitioners who are reflecting upon the practices and possibilities of deep sea diving as a method of critical aesthetic, cultural, and historical inquiry. And a lot of our conversation today is going to focus around how practices of looking and listening under and through the ocean challenge dominant narratives of past, present, and future. So let me begin with the introductions. Dr. Justin Donovan is an assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology at UCLA. His current research investigates the relationship between ecology and enslavement in the former Danish West Indies. In addition to his archaeological research, Justin is the co-founder of the Society of Black Archaeologists and an AAUS scientific scuba diver. In 2021, he was named a National Geographic Emerging Explorer and inducted into the Explorers Club as one of 50 people changing the world that you need to know about. His research has been featured on Netflix, Hulu, and in print in American Archaeology, Science Magazine, and National Geographic Magazine. Melody Chu is an associate professor of English at the University of California, Santa Barbara. We will be colleagues very soon, working across the fields of ocean humanities, science fiction, science studies, and media theory. She is the author of Wild Blue Media, Thinking Through Seawater, which won the 2020 Speculative Fictions and Cultures of Science Book Award. Ju is also co-editor with Rafiko Ruiz of Saturation, an Elemental Politics, and that's with Duke University Press also. Professor Ju has published articles in journals including Grey Room, Configurations, Women's Studies Quarterly, Resilience, and Media Plus Environment. Her new work explores mediations of seaweed in trans-Pacific contexts. And as I was preparing for this event, I was thinking that the respective fields and disciplines that our guest speakers today are working in, archaeology and media studies, aren't disciplines that readily direct our attention to the ocean. You know, we might think about the dig rather than the dive, or the archive or the text rather than the ocean as the unit of analysis. So I'm very curious to hear from each of them about their respective journey to the research and contribution that they've come to make, and how they see themselves in these disciplines and more broadly in relation to arts and cultural production. I was thinking a lot about the aspects of the show overall and of individual pieces that don't quite translate from the physical exhibition space to the virtual walkthrough. Especially because our two panelists haven't had a chance to visit the Tribeca Gallery. And so the pulsing effect that's felt when standing next to Deborah Jack's Drawn by Water, the smell of Beatrice Blow's nutmegs, the subtle interplay of sounds from the works by Deborah Jack and Tabitha Razair that create a feeling of immersion or submersion in the middle of the gallery, they don't quite come through the online tour. And I think that these incommensurabilities raise further questions about what it means to think through oceanic currents and paths. And today's panelists offer us additional tools for how we might think about these tensions and for more broadly learning through and underwater. So now I'm going to turn it over to Justin to tell us a bit about his work. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction and for contextualizing the talk and the presentations. I've struggled with trying to squeeze this down to something around 5 to 7 minutes. So I cut out pieces. Hopefully we can get to aspects of the work that I'm doing through Q&A, and then maybe some of the more sort of metaphysical discussions around water and what we can do with it, what it means to us and our relationship to it. So with that, I'm just going to jump into a presentation that I threw together real quick for you all, just to contextualize the work. My diving career actually began relatively late. Just to give a little bit of background, I was finishing up my last year of graduate school, and then I was contacted by members of a group called Diving with a Purpose, who had been helping the Smithsonian map slave shipwrecks all over the world. And they said, all the scuba divers are Black, most of the archaeologists are white. How do we change these dynamics? And so they reached out to me and my colleagues in the Society of Black Archaeologists and said, we'll train you how to scuba dive if you train us how to do archaeology. And so we took that, and we were the first sort of test cases for what it would look like to throw on a tank and start to do archaeology underwater. Underwater archaeology has been around for a while, and I can talk a little bit about that in the Q&A. But we haven't had much representation in it, which meant that we haven't had much control over what sites have been looked at and analyzed. But with that said, one of my biggest sort of objectives is to take on this larger task of mapping Black Atlantic geographies. And Black geographies globally is the ultimate vision, but in the immediate, it's the Atlantic based off of where we're located and what we have resources and access for. And to me, one of the immediate things that stood out is our need to combine terrestrial and maritime spaces and not separate these as separate geographies. So just very briefly, Virgin Islands is where most of my archaeological work is conducted at this time. We were excavating a Danish plantation site there. In the process of excavating, we're coming across historical maps. And it's from these maps that we began to ask questions, such as where are Black people situated on these maps? And in this one, this is a Danish colonial map that lists an area as unoccupied ground, which we, of course, knew was the center of a major maroon community. We started using GIS to map 2 historic maps from the time period. We took note of locations of structures, and we tried to refine a previously created algorithm to potentially develop where the best location of maroon settlement would have been on the island, so then it can inform our terrestrial excavation. We also wanted to do a diachronic analysis of time because most of our analyses of maps tend to be single-sided. So we wanted to track from 1750 to 1799, what would have been the prime locations for maroon settlement. And in that process, we noted that the potential territory shrunk by about 90% over the course of 49 years. So we could either interpret that as the maroon community is getting smaller and they're getting eradicated, or we can communicate that as they might be looking towards other means and venues by which to escape slavery. And that took us to a geography of the ocean and a geography of the sea. And I used some publicly accessible ocean current data to then begin to map where likely ocean currents would have taken maroons fleeing from St. Croix. That then led to Puerto Rico, of which Northern Puerto Rico seasonally was a prime choice. A number of individuals went to San Juan and helped to build Old San Juan. And currently their descendants live in an area mainly concentrated as Louisa, which is the highest concentration of people of African descent in the Caribbean. This whole process got me thinking about water and oceans in a whole new way, particularly in our relationship to land as archaeology. Also during this time, I published this piece that I created from tissue paper while I was writing the paper. And I had to use art as a practice to not only ground my conversation, but knowing that there's no written archive that documents this process, although there are accounts of people ending up in these shores. I used art practice as a way to think through new questions that written archives aren't able to tell us. So I had to ask myself, what time of day would they have been escaping? Who else would have been on the water? What would the water conditions have been like? What was the shape of the boat? All of these questions begin to emerge when you start to use art practice. And hopefully we can get a little deeper into this in the Q&A. I based mine actually off of an earlier piece, The Fog Warning by Winslow Homer, because there was a piece in here that said the fisherman in this picture has been successful, but the hardest task of the day is the return to the main ship. And I wanted to think through this theoretically as what does it mean to have freedom as a perpetual process, as Neil Roberts and others have articulated, versus a social condition of just being free or enslaved. All of that then took me back to diving as a method, and I'm going to run through this very briefly. But part of the work then is understanding that we're documenting history across the ocean, but what does it look like to actually document history within the ocean? And that's taken us down a route of actually exploring these different benthic zones within the ocean. And we've argued what is at the deepest parts of the ocean? What is the Haddle, metaphorically speaking, in some cases, literally speaking. And just to give you all some context as to what happens when you scuba dive and what diving actually entails, there are 3 thermoclines or 3 zones. At each of these zones, the water temperature is slightly different based off of circulation of the water. You also begin to lose your sight and visibility of certain colors as you go deeper into the ocean based off the wavelengths of light spectrum. And then finally, there's also a pressure condition that occurs while you are underwater. So at surface level, about 14.6 pounds of force are being exerted upon you. That number doubles every 10 meters as you reach different atmospheric zones, which means that weight and buoyancy become vital during that period and start to change. And then also things like oxygen become toxic as you go deeper down in the water. These are just things to consider as we consider what it looks like to map and document history under the sea. Also, new technologies. These are some of the earliest photographs taken underwater, have allowed us to view the bottom of the ocean in many different and unique ways. 1856, this is the first underwater image taken. 1893 is the first underwater portrait taken. And for us, and I say us collectively because there are a number of Black scuba divers involved in this process, we're asking, what does Black history look like at the bottom of the ocean? And I can talk about during the Q&A some of the most recent work we've done, excavating the Clotilda, the last slave ship to come into the United States in Mobile, Alabama. And then also our next future project, which is looking for and documenting the Black Star Line shipping company, which a number of these ships have sunk all over the Atlantic. And it adds another perspective onto the fact that Black history underwater doesn't just involve the slave trade, but a wider diasporic conversation. And with that, I will say thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm jotting down so many things. I have so many questions that I hope we can get into. I'm going to turn it over to Melody now. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much to May for the invitation to join this amazing panel. It's hard to go second. I'm just so struck by this research, Justin, and it really reminds me a lot of some of the conversations happening when I was in graduate school around the Black Atlantic. Jonathan Howard, a classmate of mine who's now at Yale, was really interested in Drexia and some of the sonic science fictions in the deep sea. So this is ringing a lot of bells. All right, I'll go ahead and share screen now. Okay, so my take on scuba diving as a humanities method, this I'll maybe give a little bit of context for how I came to diving. I was in my first year of graduate school. I didn't like what I was doing quite yet. I had started with a background in science fiction studies, and I remember taking just kind of a wide range of coursework. And one of the classes was in spatial theory. And at the same time, I was watching these BBC documentaries from Blue Planet, and David Attenborough narrates how there have been more people in outer space than at the bottom of the ocean. And that was followed by a characterization of the many ocean creatures as being similar to aliens in outer space. And I heard this at the same time I was taking a class that had almost entirely a canon of terrestrial readings. Nothing was on the ocean. And so I was sort of seeing these back to back going, well, what? So who in the humanities was writing about the ocean, not necessarily just as a sailor, but like really under the ocean? And so that led to sort of a complete reorientation with my project and a deep curiosity for the what it's like to experience conditions underwater. So I began to ask myself, well, what would methods of observation in the ocean, look like? Could I make a case for scuba diving as a humanities method? So in 2011, I got certified in North Carolina to scuba dive, and used that experience as the basis for writing this book, Wild Blue Media: Thinking Through Seawater. And I was really trying to pay attention to what terrestrial habits was I carrying with myself when I first learned how to dive. Okay. And I've broken this down into sort of a field guide to different things, different ways I think that one could use diving as a method in the humanities. So one, on a really basic level, is access to specific sites that you could not visit in person without the assistance of scuba diving. And one benefit I think of this is really learning to think about media and positionality, and how your eye underwater compares to your camera's eye, and how then that compares to conditions above water. So I think about the way that Graham Burnett, who's written about whales, also wrote the short piece on how even your goggle is a kind of prosthetic technology for carrying a pocket of air that allows you to clearly focus underwater. And I started out with a very basic GoPro camera that couldn't handle these, sort of underwater photography very well. The video was a little bit better. And this actually ended up being one of my favorite photographs. It's the taken inside a shipwreck with the dive master in front of me. You can sort of see their fins crossing. And my memory of this location is as a completely orange and pink anemone encrusted space. But the camera, of course, didn't pick that up without a flash. And so you see the greens and the blues and kind of the blur almost in a surreal way. And so, so I began to think about the way that bringing a subpar camera with you actually helps you tune into the conditions of mediation and think about them more, perhaps better than the fanciest SLR that's available online. As a second level, I thought about the way that diving helps you tune into phenomenology differently and also give you a better literacy for it while underwater. So Justin was talking about pressure as an element that one has to think about while diving. And this ended up being something that you can find all over different diving memoirs. So someone I looked at is Sylvia Earle, who's a major ocean activist, founded Mission Blue, and she's also a phenomenal scientist. And so in the 70s, she was part of this Tektite project, which involved spending 2 weeks underwater at the Aquarius Reef base. And she has some really interesting reflections on that the experience of transition, of becoming used to and attuned to conditions of pressure. And once your tissues are saturated with all this breathed gas, you can't just sort of pop up to the surface anytime you want, like you can in, say, video games that depict the ocean. And so I began to think about the importance of pressure as something to pay attention to because of the way that it I think maybe recharacterizes how one understands amphibiousness. Rather than being a kind of superpower or access to two spaces, Earl called diving a temporary passport into the ocean that you have to spend time decompressing in order to safely come to the surface. So you're becoming sort of temporarily oceanic and then having to spend time slowly letting your, exhaling this, pressurized gas before you come back to the surface. So I thought of diving with much more humility as this temporary passport again, like underwater. And it also gave me, I think, an interesting thing to think about with regards to the analysis of representations of the ocean. So are our representations of the ocean primarily visual and acoustic? What about the factors of pressure as something to dramatize in underwater video games, stories, or explorations like Google Ocean, Google Street View, which imports a terrestrial metaphor, the street, back underwater. So these were some of the things I was picking up from not just ocean documentaries, but very specifically scuba diving memoirs, which then talk about the sort of physiological characteristics of diving. I also thought a lot about the way that scuba diving has been used as a technique of dramatizing estrangement from terrestrial habits. So this photograph is from the Associated Press of the 2009 Maldives underwater cabinet meeting. And so you can see one of the cabinet members here signing a commitment to become carbon neutral by a specific date. And the publicity of this and the visuals produced by the underwater cabinet meeting, of course, are operating on multiple science fictional levels. They're showing you a vision of a possible post-sea level rise future, but they're showing you this in order to attempt to stop it from happening. So I thought that this underwater imagery was really powerful in transposing some of the sort of terrestrial references. You can see tables here and even name tags. Other photographs show the Maldives flag in sort of framing different divers. And so, you kind of might speculate or wonder from this, like, what does a post-diluvian future look like? Who's it affecting? But at the same time, how can representations of underwater spaces kind of be used to go back and act on land to sort of advocate for political commitment and change? So I wrote a short piece on how I saw this as an example of not science fiction in books, but instead an example of performative science fiction by sort of enacting an image of a possible future in order to change something in the present. I also think about the underwater condition, scuba diving as offering unique conditions of interpretation. So if you rely on someone else's photographs, you might not know the conditions in which they were diving or swimming, or then choosing to orient and represent some structure underwater. And these are two photographs I took off the coast of Refugio Beach, which is 20 minutes from where I live in California. Here. And I heard this structure sort of colloquially called a bookshelf reef, which to my ears as a media scholar was setting off some bells. So I had to go back and sort of take a look. And this particular one was produced by different structures of erosion. So so what was softer would have eroded out, producing, and the harder layers would have stayed put. And all kinds of organisms kind of came in. So I began to ask myself, well, what do we assume about terrestrial bookshelves, and what would it mean to submerge something like a bookshelf or another concept in media underwater, and ask, how does our habitual sort of or platonic ideal of that thing, how does that hold up under underwater conditions of observation or existence? And that's a strategy I actually use throughout Wild Blue Media. So I think about how one could displace different concepts like interface, database, inscription, or even museum, and then ask the question, how are these holding up under oceanic conditions? And the thing that really struck me with the bookshelf is that bookshelves actually really require as a precondition gravity. To hold the books in place. Whereas as a diver, here I could choose to be horizontal, kind of looking at them like this. What was this reef structure doing for the sea creatures? And we actually had a joke, my friend who I was with, that the sea creatures seemed to be shelving themselves because we found clusters of like a pile of hermit crabs in one location and then a really long stretch of sea urchins. And so the joke was, what is there a Dewey Decimal System then for the creatures that are coming here? But one could also take a much more expansive sense of the bookshelf or the shelf. And someone who's done this really well is Alice Tapunga Somerville, who was thinking about islands and continental shelves as a kind of parallel archive to other kinds of shelving practices or terrestrial archives that were important for her in thinking about matters of culture. So I began to think about again, like, how is orientation a really important factor that one could learn to pay attention to differently if one is diving or imagining or imaginatively diving into an underwater space. What are the conditions of interpretation? Might this have to do with currents, sort of pushing you along? And I'll say one last thing on this matter here, which is that as part of the field work for Wild Blue Media, I kind of operated in a lot of tourist spaces in order to access different underwater sites and also observe them myself instead of relying on someone else to do that work. And one that I went to was from Jason DeCaires Taylor, sort of his famous underwater museum near Isla Mujeres. And from visiting that site, what I noticed is every time he photographed almost every time he photographed his sculptures, they were like terrestrial portraits. But when I went there, there was a fairly strong current that was pushing me horizontal. And so in order to even stay put and try to look at faces, I had to swim kind of from the side, or I could sort of hover over them. So even at the level of photographic representation, there's such a habit to try to bring terrestrial aesthetics to framing underwater subjects. But I think that the ocean has such more potential to estrange or dehabituate us from what we've been kind of accustomed to doing. Okay, I think I'm probably at 7 minutes or more, so I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Again, my wheels are turning so much. And I want to go back, Melody, to what you said, I guess, to both of your respective journeys to the work that you're doing. And like my own dissertation and now eventually book manuscript project, it's looking at networks of Black and Asian seafarers in the 1920s to 40s, to think about the role that they felt they played in building different kinds of solidarity networks. And it came from the same sort of gap of seeing, you know, the histories of Black internationalism, Pan-Africanism, the Garvey movement. It's like, there's the node in Harlem, there's Paris, there's maybe Cape Town, but this taken for grantedness of vaguely the networks of radical sailors that forged these solidarities, and really, you know, responding to this idea of, you know, ocean as just backdrop, of ocean as just space to be moved over, rather than this real sort of world with its own kinds of temporalities, with its own ecological timelines, processes. And I'm wondering if you can both say more about the kinds of connections between the maritime and the terrestrial, because sometimes I wonder if, you know, as we're expanding the ocean humanities, or, you know, these kinds of conversations, if it's, you know, if sometimes we're creating further divides rather than really thinking about these relationalities, thinking about how, you know, pieces washing up on the shore kind of exist in a liminal space, thinking about, you know, erosions, sand, the porcelains, maybe with Beatrice Glow, or just kind of really focusing on how thinking with the oceanic or the maritime helps us to denaturalize some of these assumptions that we have, thinking about gravity and perspective and aesthetics, rather than an either or, but kind of like that, you know, iterative revisionist process that helps us to expand the questions that we're asking.
Do you want to take that first, Melody? Or you want me to to grab it?
Sure. Yeah, so I mean, I really like the sort of spirit behind this question too, because the goal for me wasn't in trying to, or actually the thing I was trying really hard not to do in my book is just reify the ocean and describe it as a certain set of properties or as an object, and not leave open its capacity for surprise, for generation. And what I wanted to do with it too is to try and channel different, like a multi-species awareness of the many organisms that make that not just live in, but like are made up of and also shape shape the ocean as these important forces. And I mean, if you even think about a jellyfish, like what is that separate from water? The water buoys it up in a certain way. So I've been thinking, so the book was, trying not to just say, here's the ocean as just another space or an object. It's absolutely sort of co-constitutive with life forms that, sort of come and shape it. And as to your question about the separation, the attempting separation again of the terrestrial and the oceanic, what's been on my mind recently, I've been reading more about corals and some of the scholarship on corals. And those are another case where, what is even, meant by coral or coral reef? There's, of course, the remainder of the skeleton. There's all the organisms that also build or sort of glom onto the reef. Then there's the post-colonial or the colonial history of the way that coral reefs were used to make all the airports on island nations in the Pacific, because they're an available source of rock. And someone who writes about this really well is Greg Dvorak. So I think that there's sort of an oscillation in my work that I try to do between thinking of the questions provoked by taking seriously the life worlds of multi-species creatures like coral, for example, but then also attending to the ways that, of course, they've always been circulating through, even in the case of coral, this is something Anne Elias says, used to legitimize empire building, because of course corals look like just this one, this hard-working organism that makes these elaborate and huge structures. And so she dug up some, Anne Elias had dug up some of this history in her book Coral Empire that I was really impressed by, and also thought was a good lesson too. So there's not only the material circulation of the coral, but also these figurative ways that we've people are always projecting onto the ocean. And in my book, I talk about this as a form of terrestrial bias at the level of language. So not just when we call something like that's a cucumber or a sea pig, or naming things at that level. I think that terrestrial bias also comes in at the way that through the way that we even use orientational words, like I'm feeling up today, my spirit's lifted. What is that for a buoyant creature living in the ocean? So I think so for me, that's where some of the science fiction comes in, is just really asking some questions about how we not only describe through nouns, but also use prepositions to orient or characterize the ocean in particular ways, and even attach emotions to these. So like the first image I showed where there's kind of that reef and then the drop off below. I think of the abyss as something, sometimes it can be a little scary, or people characterize the abyss as this frightening drop off. But for all the creatures there, the abyss is wonderful. It brings nutrients. It, is a great position with the currents. There's a whole other affect, sort of level of affect that might characterize that space. So, anyway, I'm with you in the finding different ways to constantly mess with the the terrestrial ocean separation.
Yeah. I think for me, it reigned most clear when I was doing I work on this long-term project on ecology and slavery in the Caribbean. And over and over again, we just kept finding incidences where one impacted the other. So the most salient initially was the runoff coming from sugar refined factories and rum factories going into the oceans, causing these algae blooms, which then causes effects in the ocean. Again, coral mining, similar to the Pacific Islands, it's a whole other, a similar orientation where they're cutting coral out of these ocean environments and then using them to build colonial structures. So the two are never really separated. I think probably the best way I can articulate it is that it's two separate visions of the same Earth, or two related visions of the same Earth. And we have to reconceptualize our scope to be really on a global earthly level, as opposed to, a terrestrial bias that we've had. And also understand this terrestrial bias we have is relatively new. If we look at the period of globalization and the fact that many people spent many months on the ocean for various reasons, everything from fishing to diving to transportation and so forth. And that's a whole other sort of conception and reorientation. So one of my biggest moves right now that I'm trying to do is to sort of, I'm not going to say fully erase, but delineate this or reduce the delineation of this divide, particularly when we're studying Black geographies, so that we know that we don't just occupy a terrestrial space, we don't just occupy a maritime space, but we occupy them together in different ways in different modes. And hopefully some of the work that we do will cause people to go a little bit deeper into what that means and what that has meant.
Absolutely. And I do think that, thinking from this space, like starting with the ocean and then questioning some of what's taken for granted, we can see, complicating the binary between metaphors of how we're talking about oceans, or how we're talking about different aspects of history, right? Like shard of history as like kind of an analogy versus something that like you could physically see or feel that's washing up on the coast, or that you're seeing on the ocean floor, versus so the metaphor versus the material. But also I think with the exhibition, I was trying to think about like the geopolitical and the poetic coming together in interesting ways, because sometimes we can see a divide between more literary approaches versus political science, or how they might treat the legal histories. And so I really think there's this interesting space for thinking across senses, across multiple kinds of binaries, and also, playing with the idea of sometimes we're thinking with the movements of ships, but also across space and time. So, the idea of many middle passages versus the currents, the material properties of the water itself. And so, I think that just this idea of complicating the many different binaries is really, really important. And I'm thinking about what you said, Justin, about kind of countering the limits of the archive with artistic practice, and the different kinds of genres and itineraries that we can do in those spaces. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about that, because I also think for me, this exhibition really came into being because of the limits of what I could ultimately know about the lives of these seafarers that I was researching. And, you know, there's pieces from fiction, but then there's like storytelling and relationality through the ocean of what we can know from different spaces of time that kind of transcends the linear kind of, you know, the book has to have an argument that follows a particular type of argumentation and transgression. So I guess like, where is the space of art in helping us to think beyond some of these binaries with different histories, materialities, social processes?
Yeah, that's a great question. Again, for me, I guess it does boil back down to this question of, as an archaeologist, we're often have left with limited archives in the work that we do. And everybody knows Sadia Hart, well, a lot of people know Sadia Hartman's work and this whole idea of critical fabulation and the ways in which we need to think beyond the archives and the possibility of doing it. For me, the biggest sort of coming together was as I was trying to do this archaeological work, I often encountered this issue of not having the theoretical backgrounds to explain it, coming from anthropology and from archaeology. And that's what caused me to revert to art as a means of developing and pulling from those theoretical frameworks and networks. As archaeologists and social scientists, we normally don't even consider the literary sciences and others. So that was a critical moment for me to think through sort of what all that meant. The art practice itself to me was the most important element of the piece though. And it was in the process of physically having to make a piece that I had to ask questions that weren't in the archive. And again, it's similar to diving in the ocean where you're experiencing this other world and having to ask questions like, you know, what keeps an animal buoyant underwater and all these things start to emerge. There's also a certain level of imagination and fiction that's allowed in art practice, whether it is, you know, actual digital artworks or physical visual arts. And I think that all combines to ask and answer critical questions as well. So we're actively trying to do more work to piece these things together. One of the things we've also found is a lot of archaeologists are actually artists as well. We often don't share our work with other folks, but when you study ceramics long enough, you'll start to want to make a couple, and then it turns into a whole other rabbit hole. So, so
Actually, on the ceramics note, the last time I was on a scientific ship, someone was taking core samples of deep sea mud and told me about an artist who uses deep sea mud samples as a pottery glaze on different types of work that she does. So I feel like I could imagine some of the direction.
Yeah, that was perfect. Yeah, but I'll leave it at that.
Melody, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I liked your point about thinking the geopolitical and the poetic together. And maybe just to add one thing in that direction, I mean, a question I thought about a lot throughout Wild Blue Media was objectivity and how different forms of objectivity are constructed and what the ocean might bring to having just a little bit more humility with how one characterizes one's objectivity in science or in literature or in anything else. And this even comes down to, again, for what I saw a lot, the tension between the material and the metaphoric. So when you say something like, I like the grounds of truth or the ground of an argument, you know, this is, I'm not saying we should not use that metaphor, but it reflects the place that we're you know, maybe from. Even on a ship, you know, there's a surface to stand on to press up against, and so in looking to examples in you know, literature and other writings, I wanted to ask a bigger question about the formation of objectivity that draws on so often terrestrial contexts, and because then you get to ask, well, what's objectivity in the ocean, or how are we building our notions of objectivity? Hasn't this always involved an environmental imaginary, you know, all the time, not as deterministic, but as influential in some kind of way? In addition to the question of, you know, where, not just where are you speaking from or who, but through what embodiment? So that's when, for me, the the deep sea creatures got pretty interesting, living in such, such different pressures and with different body plans. And I also looked at, where is the ocean in science fiction in less obvious ways, like not just fictions that maybe portray the ocean like 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, but in films like Arrival, or the fiction of Ted Chiang, who often channels interesting questions about orientation, or even story exhalation is kind of a great scuba diving reference point in other kinds of ways. So I was also looking, I guess this goes back to your earlier question, like for the distribution of oceanic thinking in less maybe less instinctive places.
Yeah, what you said makes me think about even how this particular exhibition, A Thousand Secrets, was conceptualized. And I'm thinking at once with the quote from Dion Brand of the ocean sounding like 1,000 secrets all whispered at the same time. But then there's the real question of like, if we were submerged under the ocean, we would not hear any of the, any of the sound from these films. We would not hear this music. We might possibly still hear the frequency from Deborah Jack's piece, but even the assumption about what immersion sounds like is a very grounded, it's something that's very taken for granted as being from a particular type of position that I hadn't thought about until this conversation, which is why I love having these conversations. And I think I want to turn it over. I have a few more questions prepared, but I want to give the audience a chance to ask some questions. So you can either type them in the chat or unmute if you want to ask some questions to the panelists now.
Can I ask one for Justin, actually?
Sure.
I was so curious how, as an archaeologist, you think about the historicity of seawater and everything that's dissolved in the seawater. Like I've heard scientists talk about sort of old water, right? Like water that hasn't moved for a while. But in your work, like, how are you thinking about the history or quality of witnessing of like the water itself?
Yeah, that's a great question. To be honest, my first answer is I'm not, but if I go a little bit deeper,
that's fair.
Yeah, I guess some of the work we've been doing is sort of these paleo rivers and streams. And we just use the term paleo because they don't exist today in the same way they did. But understanding that rivers and streams and these inland waterways have all been modified, and their modification, that whatever reason, for whatever cause, has often altered currents in some of these inland ways and the ways in which people move. And I keep thinking about Toni Morrison's quote about the flooding being a form of memory, as opposed to this sort of horrific event, and the ways in which the ocean and the land work together in different ways to reclaim sort of these paths moving around. But yeah, that's I haven't really thought too deeply about the ocean water specifically in its historical sense.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you. So I see this question from Stephen about, did either of you have particular fears to overcome regarding diving? I guess when you first got started, or maybe in different waters, locations, contexts.
Question, Melody. I didn't, but I realized in my process of watching other people get dive training, there's usually two things that restrict people from diving. One is claustrophobia. It's kind of sounds counterintuitive because the ocean is so vast, but if you're claustrophobic and you have all these things on your face and on your person, it can be a fear that you need to overcome. And that separately, but relatedly, is also tied to the psychological idea of a fear of suffering, which manifests in a fear of drowning. Because a lot of people are afraid that if something goes wrong and they are not able to get out of their circumstance, then their whole world is coming to an end. So one of the things that we often have to do with people for the first time who have fears of the water is to make them feel comfortable with holding their breath and not being able to breathe while all kinds of things are happening around them. And although we tell divers never hold your breath, it kind of alleviates that fear a bit of just having a calm in water. So those are the two fears that I've seen people have to get over.
I think that's a great summary. I mean, the I mean, I think one fear I've only periodically experienced, well, there's sort of two. One is when you've done something just before descending that you have to get your heart rate up really fast. And so if you're descending and your heart rate's up, sometimes you feel like you just can't suck enough oxygen from your regulator. So then you have to intentionally say, like, calm yourself down and maybe hold on to the descent line and breathe slowly so that you can get it back down so that you don't feel like you're not pulling as much. But so that, lots of circumstances can contribute to that, but that's maybe one that the only one that makes me scared sometimes. And I remember, no, your heart rate will calm down. Like, just like take it slow and then get back down. And then there's the wonderful feeling of finally sort of descending, and then you realize, oh yeah, like I'm back. Sort of a feeling like being home. And then the other one related to claustrophobia is I had some apprehension before diving in these caverns in Mexico, the cenotes, which are freshwater caverns, and they're pretty dark. But right before I was about to go, I remembered, like, you don't have to take seasickness medication for these ones. You're just going to drive out there and then jump in the hole. So then I felt much better. This will be a great day. Like, it'll be fine. And then sure enough, there's actually an interesting that happens too with vision. Like, when you see footage of a dark space, often it's very scary, but it's because you can't look around. Like in person, when you can look around, I think it makes a world of difference, and you can see your circumstances and feel the responsiveness of your equipment. And that for me was much better. It's kind of like how Susan Sontag talked once about the fear of watching, I think, some surgery, like from camera footage. But again, that was related to, you just can't look around if you're not the one holding the camera. So.
Thank you both. So I see one more set of questions, which are posed to both of the doctors. One is thinking about diving as a kind of travel. And if we think about mobility in that particular way, what kinds of borders, processes, barriers come into focus if we're thinking in that way? And then the second is to kind of trouble how histories of inequality, colonialism, empire might come into focus if we think about the difference between terrestrial versus underwater methods, specifically for archaeology, and what the specific underwater focus can add to that conversation it's framing.
All right, those are some pretty dense questions.
Multi-part, very thorough.
Yeah, I think the piece about travel, I think is definitely interesting. As I said, for me, it's almost like passing into another world, even though it's part of the same world. When we're in our scuba gear, sometimes doing a shore dive and literally walking into the ocean, and then you spend an hour plus underwater in the ocean, and you see, it's almost like the entire Earth is reversed. Because you have insects underwater, you've got all the things that we deal with on land underwater. And again, it speaks to that water land based the paradigm. But I think the other thing, and this is something that my colleague Elizabeth Delaray, who's on the call here, has explored, is this idea of the sort of social orientations and shifts that occur when you're on land versus when you're on the water. And the ways in which social settings, social titles, social responsibilities all shift in those areas. If we want to take it another route, you can go into Orlando Patterson's sort of social death and the ways in which the voyage across the water can lead to ontologies of becoming or unbecoming, and those other ways, because in part it's never been able to be fully controlled, as Epeli Haufa tells us, that the ocean is always the space that's constantly in flux and constantly moving, and you can't chop it up into parcels the same way you chop up in parcel lands in colonialism. So yeah, those kind of things got me thinking about those elements of it.
That's great. So I think for me, I also love that descent or becoming part of the ocean world sort of moment that's at that beginning of the dive. And in terms of traveling, I mean, you pay attention differently. I think there's also something interesting when you dive in, because you always dive with at least one buddy, if not in a larger group. And so there's something different that passes when you need to communicate with sign language. And so from a disabilities perspective, I mean, there's a dive shop called Aqua Hands that that trains hearing impaired folks to dive, but they of course retain perfect fluency with sign language underwater. And I thought that this was also a really interesting check on what kinds of what kinds of embodiments people bring to their diving practice. And another thing too, just when I've been diving in North Carolina and also in Hawaii near family, there's military bases that aren't too far away. And so in addition to ex-military taking up diving as a hobby, sometimes diving is also used in a therapeutic way too. So if you've lost mobility for walking, sometimes you can still dive with a buddy and go out and have and be supported by the buoyancy of water in a different way. Let's see. And now as to the second question, let's see. I'm just reading through the chat here. What exactly is the difference between a terrestrial method focused on inequalities of the past? Okay, so that one was more for Justin maybe than for me on the archaeology question. But yeah, I mean, I guess I think maybe back to the question I asked Justin too about the historicity of water, thinking to Derek Walcott, who said the sea is history in one famous poem, and what's also dissolved there too. What is old water, or thinking about the residence time of water with Christina Sharp, like what water has kind of pooled in different ways. So those I think lead to that kind of attention rather than seeing water only as a medium of erasure, but water as a medium for maybe also some kind of historicity or different things, or water as a witness. I mean, in Trevor Paglin's work too, like the amount of effort he went to go personally witness the seafloor cables. I think these are all different approaches that maybe start with a question at first of access of like, I want to go in person and see these structures or these infrastructures really of media communication and colonialism and surveillance. It takes you getting there first. And I think that travel, that transit then can become the starting point of many other different questions that then frame diving more than it's just witnessing, but can kind of expand out further.
Thank you. There's so much more. We could definitely be on this call for hours. I have one final question from Karabo, which is based on what, for Justin, which is a deep question of based on lines of passage and becoming and unbecoming. Has diving changed your spiritual relationship with water?
Yes, 100%.
Very deep question.
Yeah, very deep question. Yes, 100%. And I say 100%. For the longest time, I was trying to articulate what it is we're doing as archaeologists, and particularly as an archaeologist of African descent, what is considered Black archaeology? Is it Black people doing archaeology? Is it archaeology in Black spaces? Or is it a whole new reconfiguration of how archaeology is done? And in excavating the Clotilda last month, it came to mind for me that what we're doing is actually recovering ancestral memory. And whatever that looks like, however that entails. But that extends way beyond the methodologies and the theories of archaeology itself, even though we've been trained in a set of methods and theories. And that requires us to be cognizant not only of the work that we're doing and how we're doing it, but what are the ramifications of it. And we recently did an interview with two divers who dove into the hull of the slave ship, the Clotilda. And we asked them, what was that experience like? And they said there was a certain type of energy that was there. And it got me thinking much more deeply around the physical and literal energy that's trapped in a space that's literally been submerged by sediment underwater for over 200 years. And what happens when we begin to release that by excavating it? Where does that go? How does it impact people? And then how do we deal with and process these things? So going deeper into the ocean caused me to ask all these questions that I've never asked, honestly, on a terrestrial site before in the same way. So I think that's just one way in which it's changed my spiritual relationship to water, I guess you could say.
Yeah, and I think that something that's really interesting about what you just said is like, if we think about different indigenous epistemologies and traditions, like this idea that, water doesn't just hold data because there are cables laid there. It's like water holds memories, water holds stories. It's something that like science is very recently catching on to what communities' ancestors have known for so long. And I'm curious when we think about the different kinds of genres and disciplines and ways of thinking that you all are working across, like how that tension between science, method, spirituality, tradition, older different ways of knowing kind of all meshes together to inform your praxis.
Yeah, you want to take it, Melody? Yeah.
Good question.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's all kind of come together in this way where you can't disarticulate them. It literally blends together, and it's one of those things I have to compartmentalize when I write for academic settings. But when I express myself through art or through other means, or even through lectures or books, I can be more expansive in that process. So I think it's important to have an attunement to that articulation as well. Oftentimes we're taught to focus either on what we're producing, the results of the data we're collecting, or how our physical bodies are impacted, but we're not taught to reflect on and how to reflect on the spiritual elements of the work that we do. So I started meditating a lot more just through this whole process of doing underwater archaeology, just to sit there with ideas in my head until I arrive at some sort of understanding and how they all piece together. So yeah.
That's amazing. I think for me, one thing I've had to bracket is the academic reflex to try to inhabit the position of the expert or the sort of authority figure, because what the ocean does all the time, it checks you. There's a kind of humility, I think, there, both for what you might encounter and then also for who is potentially a teacher for you. So is that going to be a member of a certain community? Is it going to be the scientist you hang out with because you're on the boat together? Is it going to be maybe a particular creature whose life ways have something to teach you? And I felt like that also came out in Sylvia Earle's writings too, like the sense of humility through connection with the ocean and through diving. And she has this wonderful reading, and I always love finding these literary readings and science texts, but she had a wonderful reading of the word fathom and its etymology, which has to do traditionally not just with measuring the depth of the ocean, but was at one point defined as the length of a person's arms around the object of their affection. So in other words, fathoming was the measurement of a hug, like in a certain place. So I thought that was really kind of a nice moment of thinking about your own witnessing, your embodiment, your observation as a sort of measure, and it's a very particular measure, not the only one, but you're always sort of measuring yourself through your encounters in different spaces. So I think that for a lot of this, embracing kind of your limited positionality and being good with making friends is also a way to sort of learn one's way into very different bodies of knowledge and relating to the ocean. And so for me, where that's coming through more recently is in some new work I've been doing on seaweeds and connecting with some activist communities in Hawaii over limu or seaweed, and ways of getting to know the seaweeds through even using your toes to sort of feel out where they are, and the way that seaweeds are also always connected to people too. So
yeah, like the last comment, it makes me think a lot about how categories like intimacy would be unsettled if we think about the different kinds of pressure, gravity, force, of like thinking those through and below, thinking those through the ocean, beyond just terrestrial orientations in terms of thinking about the challenges on kinds of kinship, communication, relationality. So like just thinking about that the etymology of fathom, I think, just raised those questions of additional kinds of categories that we can continue to unsettle. And I think if there isn't another question, we might have to leave it there for today. But this has been a fantastic, fantastic panel. Well, thank you, Elizabeth. I am excited that you'll be able to see the exhibition. And thank you all for coming. I really appreciate holding space with you on this Saturday day, whatever time it is. And yeah, thanks again to Apex for the opportunity with the open call and for the opportunity to bring these different thinkers, writers, creators together in conversation. That's been very exciting for these times. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. Dr. Chu, Dr. Donovan, and of course, soon to be Dr. Miller, for bringing this incredible, deep and expansive to think about ocean words and metaphors. It's been so incredible to hear you bring your research to us. So I feel really privileged today. And just to remind everybody that this event has been recorded and it will go up on the website, and hopefully that'll just probably be within the week. So please share it with others who weren't able to make it today to be able to watch and listen at a future date. And also in the chat there, I just dropped the exhibition link for the page, 1,000 Secrets, and then the exhibition brochure where you can read a beautiful essay written by May. And then, of course, the upcoming events, which will be on June 25th and July 9th. So please consider registering for those. And again, thank you all for your incredible work and words and conversation that we were able to witness today. Have a wonderful rest of your Saturday, everyone.
Thanks, Maya.
Bye.
Bye.